Hello everyone, welcome back to my video. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, we are going to talk about what to do once you've gotten your first grocery store orchid, which is probably a phalaenopsis like you see here, and the flowers have started to fade. What to do next? The next thing that you're going to do most likely is to repot. And repotting has nothing to do with, taking a plant apart or taking a pot together because you want to, but it's really about the health of the plant. So in these two examples for today, these were two purchases that I had made from a local grocery store. One of them I already chopped the blooms. The other one I'm going to chop for you. And my reasons for repotting are, number one, we're in the correct season, which is we're going into spring. So the plants are actually going into a season where they will start growing roots and leaves rather than flowers, especially these grocery store orchids, which are known to bloom mainly in the winter time because that's when we get a temperature drop. And I'll talk about that in another video when I get into what's blooming this month. But first, we'll start off with the bigger one. The smaller one I do have soaking in some water here so that when we do repot it and pull it out of this moss, it's a bit easier. So first off, we're going to start with the bigger orchid. This was also a white blooming orchid, just like the one here, but the flowers were a lot bigger, and it was staged up here with my little, I guess, decorative set that I put together on my kitchen counter. So this basically is in an all bark mix, which dries way too fast in my environment. So we're going to move it into an all moss mix. Yeah, and today I bought some orchid moss from Lowe's, which is only like $5, and I love it. It's really fluffy and light, and it lasts for a long time. And I'm not going to throw away this bark. I'm actually going to just mix it in. I do reuse my media, especially if it's good, and this bark is perfectly fine. Having second thoughts on that. Some of it is falling apart as I just squeeze, but some of them aren't. Yeah, so I think I'm just going to keep the bark and put it in with the moss that I'm going to use. So they like to put these layers of decorative moss on here. It does nothing for the plant. It's just for decoration. So we'll just go ahead and squeeze the pot around. As you can see, the roots were decent, which is why I purchased this. This was most likely a sale orchid, yeah. $6.40. This one was, oops, spilled some of the water out. This one was $2.50. So I do like to purchase them on clearance if the roots are fine, because it tells me that I can go ahead and save the plant, or at least purchase the plant and keep it going. So just gonna squeeze the pot around nice and gently until you can until the plant starts pulling out. This one I'm gonna have a hard time because there's a root or some roots that are coming out the bottom. I don't think I can save that root. It's already cut pretty bad, so I'm just gonna pull it off. This plant has plenty of roots, so it'll survive pulling off a couple of its roots to get it out of the pot. And she's out. So we're gonna just massage the roots until all the medium comes out. Surprisingly, this doesn't have a peat moss net, which sometimes you'll find at the base of the plant, which means that no one has repotted it since they first put it in a pot ever. But this one doesn't have one, so it means that it has been repotted. It's probably a pretty old orchid. And what I'm gonna do is now remove any of the bad roots. So basically, I'm gonna remove any of the roots that are dried like this, or that are mushy. This doesn't have many bad roots, so I won't be taking a lot off of her. So I'm just gonna take my pruners here, and I don't want this to fall on my medium, so I'll just put this in the sink, cover the drainage hole so that one of the bark falls down my drain, and just snip away these old roots here. And one of the reasons that you want to do that, it's not even because of like the whole aesthetic of the plant and you want to just have a good looking plant. It's also the health of the plant. These roots will eventually rot. And if you're going to repot any type of plant, you should always remove any of the dying roots so that you can remove any of the potential decaying matter that you're going to have in the pot. So basically you'll save yourself having to repot the plant sooner than later if you remove anything that's decaying or looking like it's going to decay. See, here we have a leaf, a very old leaf, so I'm just going to rip that off. All right, the plant actually looks pretty good. There's not, again, the root system is pretty good. Although these roots aren't green, it's because they weren't exposed to much light, but they're still plump, so we're going to save them. The ruffling that you hear is a bit of this dried leaf. It was purchased like this. Oh, so for me, if the dry part rips right off, I'll take it off. But if it's to a point where I have to cut it off, I'll let it completely dry out until I can rip it off like that. Problem solved. I don't really care how the plant, like if it's not broken, don't fix it. So if the plant's fine with a portion of its leaf sitting there, I'm gonna leave it there. But if it's completely crumpled and I can remove it easily, I'm gonna do that as well. So let's get into repotting this. We're gonna put it back into the same exact setup. We're just gonna increase the water retentive medium. Excuse me, I can't speak today. This mic is tucking in. We're gonna increase the water retentive medium by adding a lot more sphagnum moss into the mix. So here's our orchid. We're gonna just gently tuck her into the pot. Actually, what I'm gonna do is put a small layer of sphagnum moss at the bottom. In my environment, the pot and air inside of the pot, which is promoted by using moss and things like bark, makes the pot actually dry quicker. So I like to have a water retentive medium around the pot 100%. And it's best to start at the bottom of the pot so that as the pot dries and the water moves upward, it evaporates within the moss. See that there? It's at the bottom of the pot. So as the moisture evaporates, it'll be easy to tell when to water, because if the bottom of the pot is dry, it means that the pot is definitely dry. Because although the water evaporates in an upward motion, it collects in a downward motion. So if the bottom of the pot is dry, most likely the rest of the pot is. And also, if you have the moss at the bottom of the pot touching the moss that's going all through the pot, you'll have a more even distribution of your moisture. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking handfuls of moss and basically pressing them down on the sides of the pot. Eventually the middle of the pot will fill, but I'm really just concerned about the sides because that's where the roots, ooh, I tucked the leaf in there, so I gotta get her out. That's where the roots are going to swirl, and normally the sides of the pot dry the fastest. So I have a theory in my mind that if I have more of the water retentive medium around the sides of the pot will dry a bit slower, and I won't have to water so often. So I am grabbing handfuls of bark to put in here as well, just to save on the moss, number one, but also to promote just a bit of air inside of the pot, because I'm going to pack this pretty tight with the moss given that my environment lacks humidity. And I can get away with that because my environment lacks so much humidity. So I'm just stuffing, just making sure again that my sides are tightly packed with moss and that the roots are touching, that the moss is touching all throughout the pot from the bottom to the top. Gonna add in some more bark. See, I'm almost done completely to the top here. And again, I am pressing down, but I'm not squeezing it in. I'm just pressing down so that when I water, I get the most retention. But also, as the moss dries, it does allow a lot of air as the water evaporates to fill in its place. So it's going to re-puff up again, and then it's easy for us to tell when to water because it becomes very light, not only in weight but in color. So when the moss is wet, it is a bit dark. Probably can't see it here because this is not drenched, but when it's dry, it's very, very light, and you can almost probably hear that as opposed to wet moss. Yeah. So we're almost done potting this No ID fowl up. Again, she was completely white, and we're repotting her because the blooms were fading, although the roots were in very good condition. It's springtime, and lastly, because I wanted to put her in a much more water retentive setup, which is mainly moss. So once I have the moss basically almost to the top, I'm gonna just put a layer of bark on top of the moss. I learned that from Miss Orchid but it does work in terms of not allowing so much algae to build up, because the more moss that you have exposed to light, the more it's prone to grow algae. Unless you're applying something like Physan 20, which I used to do, but I haven't purchased it in quite some time. Physan 20 is sort of like the Lysol for plants and pots. You can put it in your water and water with it, and it'll keep all the fungal and bacterial organisms completely down to a minimum. But another thing that you can do is use charcoal. All right, so she is completely potted up, and I don't have to water because this moss is already pretty moist in there. And I'm just gonna put her back where she goes. Voila. Next we have the mini, and I'm gonna do something that a lot of people probably gonna be like, what the? But as you can see, I have a couple of buds that have yellowed on this smaller orchid, which is a term called bud blasting. So I don't know exactly what happened, but most likely it was the temperature change from the supermarket, the car ride, to then being on a wall that's like quite a few feet from the northern window in my apartment. So there were probably a lot of factors that went into it, but bud blast is really hard to narrow down. But basically what I'm gonna do is cut these babies off because I want my plant to focus on the foliage and the leaves. And by cutting off the flowers, which actually use a lot of energy, the plant will refocus. Well, hopefully, it will refocus into the leaves and the roots. Sometimes when you snip off your flowers, it will go ahead and grow another spike. And, it's up to you to decide what you want to do. But if we're in my situation, if my plant did grow another spike, I would leave it there because I know that's what the plant actually wants to do. But yeah, I normally do cut the flowers off for repotting, especially in the springtime, because these orchids normally bloom in the fall and winter. So if I can get it to become very strong over the growth period, which is the which is the spring going into summer, I can get some pretty nice blooms going into fall and winter. So I did soak her while I was repotting the other plant. And again, soaking was just to be able to squeeze this out of the tiny pot that it's in and then remove the moss. So again, this moss actually looks and smells decent. It doesn't smell like ammonia or anything, which is something that you probably shouldn't reuse if your moss does smell like when you when you remove it from the pot. And look how easy that is to just remove softened moss. I'm telling you guys, these are great plants to start with, because for orchids and these store-bought orchids, you basically take care of them by giving them some light. So you don't want to put them directly in the window. Put them somewhere where they're receiving light from the window. And then you want to water them when they're dry, when your pot is light. Or when the roots, see how green these roots are? When they're not watered, they become gray. And your pot becomes lighter because the medium which you're using, which should be something like moss and bark, will also become very light when it has very little water in it. And secondly, orchids are pretty forgiving when it comes to missing your watering, especially these type of orchids. They are epiphytes, so in the wild they grow attached to trees, so they're actually used to drying out and then being completely drenched with water during a rain or a very, very heavy humid spell. I don't know why I can't speak. So like when the clouds roll in the forest and they bring in all that moisture, plants like this benefit because they're completely exposed as they hang for dear life on the tree. So what I'm doing is basically like the other orchid. This orchid actually has quite a bit of mushy roots, which are coming right off with a simple tug. So I'm just removing those before I snip off all these empty roots, because these won't do anything. So these are the actual roots of the orchid, and they're covered by this filament which absorbs the water. So if you don't have the filament for the roots, if it's completely mushy and or dried out, it needs to be removed. So although this at the end seems like it's healthy, it probably will rot, so it will get removed. So again, I'm just going to snip off the strands. I'm not doing it closer to the camera because the medium is sitting over there in the sink, and I don't want this to fall in the medium, and I don't want to rearrange everything again. But I will show you what I cut off. I'll just bring it over to the camera. So this actually I would call a rescue. You know, something that I bought on clearance that was clearly about to die if it stayed in that pot, because that moss wasn't drying. It was very tight in that pot, and I guess the grocery store conditions are pretty decent, so the pot just wasn't drying. This plant has a lot of wet roots. It actually, all the roots that are dry, all the roots that are dead aren't even dry. They're all very mushy, which means that this sat in the water for a very long time. And here are some of the roots I removed. So as you can see, some green ones came off, but it's because they were attached to a dying portion of the root that was attached to the main portion of the mother plant, indicating that it was most likely going to die. And I don't want to have to repot soon, so yeah. So there we have our orchid. It's really tiny. All right, so I'm actually gonna go ahead and put it in, you know, it's weird, square pot, but a round decorative pot. And again, we're gonna throw some medium at the bottom here, that moss, so that we can have the water retention here in our dry environment. And then the orchid. So do you guys also purchase your plants on clearance? I noticed that especially during holiday time, like with Valentine's Day approaching, there's some really, really nice plants, but I will probably be in the store on February 15th because that's when they'll be on clearance, and I can decide what plant I want to take home for $7 that people bought for 60 bucks yesterday. It's really insane how supply and demand works. So yeah, I'm putting this mainly in moss, but I'm trying to get some bark in here. This one, I'm not packing as much as the other orchid because it doesn't have as many roots. So I'm going to keep it a bit more airy. But at the same time, I am going to make sure that, there's no air pockets, like huge gaps or huge holes that I can visibly see at least. So basically, she's done being potted up. You want to stop somewhere at the base of the orchid. You don't have to um, pot her completely to the top. I do stop at the base of the orchid and then add the bark in because the bark isn't going to really retain much water. And what you don't want to happen is you having too much moss that stays wet at the base of the orchid where the leaves are, because that's when you start to get into rot if that stays wet too long. The roots can endure a bit more of a moisture retentive medium than the leaves can with regard to exact contact. So you want to make sure that the leaves are far from, well, not far, but not touching the moss. Bark, I would say, is okay in this type of environment. And there she is, all potted up. All right, so that's what you want to do. And again, you want to put them somewhere where they do receive light, but not directly in the window. But if you do have them in a window, you want to then get into where the window is facing and if how long or so you can keep them in that direct sunlight. This here behind me is a east facing window, so it gets the sunrise. My plants do depend on those blinds, me moving those blinds with regard to where the sun is. So sometimes I have to keep those blinds a bit more closed and a bit more open depending on how direct the sun is, and that depends on your season. So you have indirect sunlight in the winter and way more direct sunlight in the summertime. And depending on where you live, your fall and summer will give you that transition period. So thank you again for staying tuned to this video. I hope someone learned something today with regard to purchasing that first orchid, because sometimes they seem intimidating because people say they're hard, but they really aren't if you just follow a simple rule with giving them a little light and water when they're needed. Blooming is another thing and normally comes naturally because they bloom in a certain season with the temperature drop in the fall time. So stay tuned for my next video because I'm actually going to talk about some of my favorite plants this season, and a couple of them, I think like 4 out of 5, I may make the list 10, I'm not sure, but 4 out of 5 of them that I have right now are all in bloom, so can't wait for that. I don't know if you just heard that, but that was Oscar. Thank you again for staying tuned. Check me out on my social media, Instagram and Facebook at The Right Path. I'll put it up on the screen. Bye, guys.